Frank Callahan, a retired soldier, lives a quiet life on his farm, tending to his beloved horse, Ghost. But when a ruthless cartel, led by Santiago Mendoza, tries to take his land, Frank refuses to back down. The cartel retaliates, burning his barn, attacking his home and abducting his niece, Lena. Determined to get her back, Frank calls on his old war brothers, Bo, Kane, Ghost, Cruz, and Hank. Together, they turn the farm into a fortress, ready to defend against Mendoza's army. The first attack is brutal, but Frank and his men fight back with everything they have, forcing the cartel to retreat. Mendoza, enraged by the resistance, abducts Lena and issues an ultimatum. Frank surrenders or she dies. But Frank isn't a man who makes deals. He and his team cross the border, striking at Mendoza's stronghold in a relentless assault. Explosions rip through the compound, gunfire lights up the night, and Frank finally faces Mendoza in a final showdown. The cartel leader dies, his empire in ruins, but the victory feels hollow. Hank, Frank's closest friend, doesn't survive the battle. The farm, once a place of peace, is now a battlefield covered in scars. As the dust settles, Frank considers walking away. But when Ghost reminds him of the road still ahead, he realizes the fight isn't over. Somewhere out there, another man like Mendoza is waiting to rise. And as long as evil men exist, Frank and his brothers will be there to stop them. But is there ever truly an end to war? Only the road ahead will tell. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from, and if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The crisp morning air carried the scent of fresh soil and hay as Frank Callahan stepped onto his front porch, a cup of black coffee steaming in his calloused hands. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills, casting a golden glow over the land he'd spent the last decade nurturing. His farm, nestled deep in the Texas countryside, was his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of his past battles had no hold on him. Ghost, his Mustang, stood by the wooden fence, ears perked up at the sound of the creaking porch. Frank smiled as he took a sip of his coffee. The horse was more than just an animal to him. Ghost was a piece of his soul, a connection to a simpler life before the wars, before the loss. Just beyond the barn, parked in the same spot it had been for years, sat his other Mustang, a '69 Mach 1, its faded blue paint gleaming under the morning sun. It was a relic of another time, just like him. Frank walked toward the barn, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. His routine was the same every morning: feed Ghost, check the perimeter of the property, and spend an hour tinkering with the Mach 1. Routine kept him sane. Routine kept the nightmares at bay. But today, something felt off. A crow cawed from a nearby oak tree, and Frank's sharp eyes caught movement at the far end of his property. A dust trail rose behind an old pickup truck, driving slowly down the dirt road that led past his farm. Strangers were rare out here. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and folks knew better than to wander onto land that wasn't theirs. He watched as the truck slowed near the entrance of his property, hesitated, then continued on. Frank exhaled through his nose, setting his coffee cup on the hood of the Mustang. His instincts, honed by years in the military, told him something was coming. He'd learned long ago that trouble didn't always announce itself with gunfire and explosions. Sometimes it crept in quietly, like a snake in the grass. He walked into the barn, the scent of old hay and motor oil filling his lungs. Ghost snorted as Frank ran a hand down the horse's strong neck. "Something doesn't feel right, boy," he murmured. The animal huffed, as if in agreement. Frank moved toward the workbench where the Mach 1's engine lay in pieces, waiting for his skilled hands to bring it back to life. He reached for a wrench when he noticed something. His tools had been moved. Not by much, but enough for him to know they hadn't been in this exact position yesterday. His grip tightened around the wrench as he scanned the barn. Everything else seemed in place. The doors were locked the night before. No forced entry. No obvious signs of a break-in. Still, the feeling in his gut twisted tighter. The sun was higher now, and Frank decided to take a ride along the perimeter of his land. He saddled Ghost, his movements fluid from years of muscle memory. The horse responded eagerly, sensing his rider's unease. As they trotted toward the fence line, Frank kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for anything out of place. And then he saw it. About 100 yards from his property line, deep in the tall grass, were tire tracks. Fresh ones. Someone had parked there, watching. Frank dismounted, crouching beside the tracks, running his fingers through the disturbed soil. Too big for a car, too narrow for a tractor. A motorcycle. His jaw tightened. He had seen the signs before. The slow-moving truck, the disturbed tools, the feeling of being watched. It was a message. Someone was testing him. By the time he returned to the barn, the coffee on the hood of the Mustang had gone cold. Frank poured it out onto the dirt, his eyes never leaving the tree line beyond the field. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be good. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the land in hues of burnt orange and deep violet as Frank Callahan leaned against the fence post, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line once more. The silence of his land, once comforting, now carried an unfamiliar weight. The tire tracks in the tall grass gnawed at the back of his mind. Someone had been watching. Someone had walked his property while he slept, and that wasn't something he took lightly. The smell of smoke drifted through the evening air, not thick enough to be alarming, but enough to remind him of war. He let out a slow breath and turned back toward the barn. Ghost trotting alongside him as if sensing his unease. The old horse was restless, ears twitching toward the distant hills. Frank reached up, running a rough hand down the animal's strong neck, the warmth of his coat grounding him for just a moment. "I don't like it either, boy," he murmured. Inside the house, he locked the doors, not out of paranoia but instinct. His fingers traced the scar along his forearm as he pulled open the cabinet beneath the sink. Hidden behind a line of old rags and motor oil sat a heavy black case. He hadn't touched the rifle inside in years, hadn't felt the weight of it since he left the fight behind, but tonight the past was bleeding into the present in a way he couldn't ignore. The knock at the door was slow, deliberate, not the kind of knock that belonged to neighbors or anyone who had business with him. It was the sound of men who wanted something but didn't fear what it might cost to take it. Frank exhaled through his nose, set the rifle case back down, and straightened. He wasn't a man to shy away from confrontation, but he wasn't about to invite it inside either. He unlatched the door, keeping it halfway closed as he met the gaze of the man standing on his porch. The visitor was younger than Frank had expected, no more than his late 30s, but there was something in his eyes that belonged to men who had seen too much. A cold, empty thing that spoke of a life without hesitation. He was flanked by two others, both tall, both built for trouble. They didn't wear leather or chains, but Frank knew what they were the moment he saw them. "You Callahan?" the man asked, his voice smooth, almost polite. Frank didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let the moment sink into the thick night air. "Depends who's asking." The man smiled. Not a friendly smile, not the kind that reached the eyes. "Name's Mateo Rojas. You got a nice place here. You quiet? Secluded?" He glanced over Frank's shoulder into the darkened house, taking in the details with practiced ease. "Shame if something happened to it." Frank's jaw tightened. He knew a threat when he heard one, didn't need to dress it up in words. "Don't much like uninvited guests," he said, his voice low, steady. "I don't much like wasting time," Rojas replied, his smile unwavering. "My employer, Mr. Mendoza, has taken an interest in this land. He thinks it would serve him better under new management." Frank let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. He knew the name. Mendoza ran Los Sangrientos, a cartel that had been carving its way through Texas, swallowing up small towns, bribing officials, leaving bodies in its wake. He had heard of them in passing, but now they were on his doorstep. "You got 1 week to reconsider," Rojas continued, his tone never changing. "Think about it, Callahan. There's easier ways to go than the hard way. Frank's fingers curled into his palm. He had been given ultimatums before, had stood in front of men who thought they could push him, break him. He had buried those men. He let the words hang in the air before speaking. Not for sale. Rojas chuckled, shaking his head as if he'd expected the answer. That's the thing about pride, Mr. Callahan. Gets a man killed. He tapped the porch railing twice before stepping back. Enjoy your week. Frank watched as the three men retreated down the dirt road, their dark SUV kicking up dust as it disappeared into the night. He stood in the doorway long after they were gone, listening to the distant hum of cicadas, the whisper of the wind through the fields. His land had never felt more like a battlefield. Frank Callahan stood in the doorway of his home long after the dust from Rojas's SUV had settled. The night was colder than usual, the wind carrying an eerie stillness that made his land feel different, as if the shadows had thickened, stretching over the fields like an unseen force was waiting to take hold. He exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, before stepping back inside and locking the door. The past had a way of catching up, no matter how far a man ran. Frank had built his life on quiet routines, had buried the soldier inside of him beneath hard soil. But men like Rojas didn't just make threats. They didn't give warnings. They issued death sentences. He moved through the darkened house, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The rifle case under the sink wasn't enough. He had a few handguns, a shotgun behind the bedroom door, but he knew what he was up against. Cartel soldiers didn't fight fair. They came in numbers. They came with fire. He needed something bigger. He needed people who knew how to fight like he did. His steps led him to the farthest corner of the house, to the old wooden armoire that hadn't been opened in years. The key hung on a nail by the window, collecting dust. He pulled it free and turned it in the lock, the tumblers clicking into place. The door creaked open, revealing a small steel safe bolted to the floor. Inside, beneath layers of carefully folded cloth, sat the past he had tried to leave behind. His K-bar knife still sharp, still balanced perfectly in his hand. A SIG P226, its slide oiled and smooth, but it was the object at the very bottom that held the most weight. The satellite phone. He picked it up, rolling it over in his palm. The battery was still good. A line to the only men he knew would understand what was coming, the ones who had walked the same blood-soaked paths he had. Frank flipped the phone open, hesitated for just a second, then dialed the first number. It rang twice before a voice answered, gruff and low. Reaper. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Hank Dawson. Need you. A pause, then a long exhale. Shit. Frank could hear the distant clink of ice in a glass, the creak of a chair. He knew exactly what Hank was doing, drinking himself into the kind of sleep that numbed the things men like them could never forget. Where? Hank asked. My farm. Texas. Bad. Bad. A moment of silence, then the sound of liquid being tossed into a sink. I'll be there. Frank hung up and dialed the next number. This one picked up before the first ring ended. Callahan. Frank let out a short breath. Kane. A chuckle on the other end. Marcus Kane. The wildest man Frank had ever met. And also, the only one crazy enough to build explosives out of damn near anything. Kinda thought you were dead, old man. Not yet. Need you here. When? Yesterday. The laughter faded. That serious? Frank didn't answer. I'm on my way. Frank went down the list. Samir Ghost Ramani, the best intelligence man he had ever worked with. Bo Jackson, their heavy gunner. Victor Cruz, a medic who had saved Frank's life more than once. One by one they answered, and one by one they told him the same thing. They were coming. Frank set the phone down and stared at it for a long moment. It was a strange thing, calling in old debts, summoning ghosts from the past. But if there was one thing he knew about the men he had fought beside, it was that they never left a brother behind. By the time the sun began to rise, Frank had already prepared the guest rooms, cleaned his guns, and walked the fence line twice. Ghost paced near the barn, sensing the tension in the air. He was ready, and soon his pack would be too. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch, his rifle leaning against the worn wooden railing, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. The night stretched long and silent, but his mind was loud. He had seen too many battles, too many men broken by war, too many lives shattered before they had a chance to mean something. The men he had called were the only ones he trusted, but they were also men who had been changed by war in different ways. As the first light of dawn bled across the sky, the sound of an approaching engine echoed through the hills. Frank rose, gripping his rifle out of instinct. Dust curled in the morning air as an old black Dodge Ram crested the hill, its engine growling like a beast that had seen its share of road and ruin. The truck rolled to a stop near the barn, and the driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall and broad, with a thick beard and a face lined with age and alcohol. Hank Reaper Dawson. Frank had last seen him nearly a decade ago, drinking himself into oblivion at a dive bar outside of El Paso. Hank had been a sniper in their unit, the best Frank had ever known. Now, his eyes were sunken, his skin weathered like an old leather belt. But when he looked at Frank, the sharpness was still there, buried beneath the weight of too many dead men. "Still alive," Hank muttered, stretching his shoulders. "Not for lack of trying," Frank replied. Hank glanced at the land, at the barn, at the Mustang still parked near the porch. "Nice place." He pulled a flask from his jacket, took a long drink, then wiped his mouth. "Who are we killing?" Frank smirked. "Frank, we'll get to that." Another set of headlights cut through the early morning mist. A second vehicle pulled in, this one a matte gray Chevy Tahoe. The door swung open before the engine had even died. Marcus Kane stepped out, grinning like he had just walked into a party instead of a war zone. His arms were covered in tattoos, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Jesus Christ, Frank," Kane said, exhaling smoke. "You could have just invited me for a barbecue. Didn't think you'd come if it was just burgers." Frank shot back. "Yeah? Well, I like a little gunfire with my steak." Kane stomped out his cigarette and slapped Hank on the shoulder. "Still drinking yourself stupid, huh? Still blowing shit up for fun," Hank countered. "Touché." Frank led them toward the house, but before they could step onto the porch, another vehicle approached, a sleek black Audi, too nice for these dirt roads. It rolled to a stop, and the driver stepped out with the grace of a man who had spent years moving unseen. Samir Ghost Rahmani. Unlike the others, Ghost hadn't let himself go. He was lean, his sharp brown eyes scanning every inch of the property as if he had already memorized every exit and blind spot. He adjusted his sleeves, nodded once at Frank, then at the others. "This place isn't as secure as it should be," he said in his quiet, analytical voice. "Good to see you too, Ghost," Frank said dryly. Ghost didn't smile. He never did. He just took a slow breath and nodded. "I assume there's a reason we're here. We're waiting on two more," Frank said. As if on cue, a motorcycle roared in the distance, closing in fast. The Harley rumbled up the driveway, dust curling in its wake. The rider pulled up beside the Tahoe, killed the engine, and swung a leg over the seat. Bo Jackson. Bo had been the muscle of their unit, a heavy gunner who could turn the tide of a battle with sheer firepower alone. He was bigger now, broader, his arms thick as tree trunks. His bald head gleamed under the morning light, and his deep voice rumbled like thunder. "God damn, I missed this," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Frank, you son of a bitch, you finally decided to get the band back together." Frank chuckled. "Something like that." Bo grinned at Kane. "Still making things go boom." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Kane replied. Ghost cleared his throat. "Where's Cruz?" As if summoned by the name, a fourth vehicle, a beat-up Ford Bronco, rattled up the driveway. The engine sounded like it was held together with duct tape and prayers, but it made it. The door opened, and out stepped Victor Cruz. Cruz had been their medic, the only man who could patch them up and cuss them out in the same breath. He was older now, his hair touched with grey, but he still carried the same sharp-eyed focus he always had. "You look like shit, Frank," Cruz said, slamming the door shut. "Good to see you too," Frank replied. Cruz rolled his shoulders. "Somebody better be bleeding for me to be here." "Not yet," Frank said. Hank scratched his beard. "So, are we gonna talk about why you called us, or are we just standing around waiting for someone to start shooting?" Frank took a deep breath, looking at the men gathered before him. His men, his brothers. They had fought together, bled together, survived hell together. And now they were here again. "The cartel wants my land," Frank said. "They gave me a week to reconsider." The words settled over them like a heavy fog. "Cartel?" Bo asked, his expression darkening. "Los Sangrientos," Frank said. Ghost exhaled sharply. "They're not just any gang, Frank. They're a goddamn army." "Yeah," Frank said. "That's why I called you." Silence stretched between them. Then Hank grinned, slow and dangerous. "Well, shit. Why didn't you just say so?" Bo cracked his knuckles. "I was getting bored anyway." Cruz sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know this is going to get messy, right?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, but I don't plan on dying easy." Ghost folded his arms. "Then let's make sure none of us do." The six of them stood there, the weight of what was coming settling into their bones. They weren't young men anymore, weren't the reckless soldiers they had once been, but war had a way of calling them back, of whispering in their ears that there were still battles left to fight. Frank looked at each of them, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not doubt, purpose. The old wolves were back, and this time they were the ones hunting. The air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and the lingering burn of cigarettes as the six men sat around Frank's dining table. The house was old but sturdy, built with the kind of bones that could withstand time, just like the men sitting inside it. They weren't kids anymore, but there was a weight in the room that hadn't been there in years, the weight of an impending fight. Frank had spread out a rough map of the property, marking points of weakness, entry paths, and where they could set up defenses. He traced a scarred finger along the dirt road that led from the highway to his land. It was the only way in, unless someone wanted to trek through miles of thick brush. The cartel would come that way first, fast, armed, and confident. "We've got less than a week before they come knocking again," Frank said, his voice steady but heavy. "And they won't come alone. Mendoza's men don't make threats they don't intend to follow through on." Bo leaned forward, cracking his knuckles. "Let 'em come, I got something for 'em." Cruz exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "This ain't some bar fight, Bo. These guys play for keeps. You ever seen what the cartel does to people who get in their way?" "I don't need to see it," Bo shot back. "I just need to shoot it." Ghost was already working on his laptop, hacking into systems with that eerie, quiet focus he had always carried. "They've got eyes on this place," he murmured, his fingers moving effortlessly across the keys. "They know we're here. They're watching." "How close?" Frank asked, his gut twisting. Ghost's expression didn't change, but the sharpness in his eyes darkened. "Close." And then, like an answer to his words, the first bullet shattered the window. The glass exploded inward, spraying shards across the room. Everyone reacted on instinct, dropping low as more gunfire ripped through the night, splintering wood, punching holes through the walls. The sound of automatic weapons filled the air. The cartel wasn't waiting. Frank hit the ground hard, crawling toward the rifle he had left leaning against the wall. Bo was already moving, pulling a pistol from his belt and firing blindly through the broken window. "Son of a bitch! They're early!" Ghost flipped the table onto its side, creating a makeshift barrier. "Move! Move, move!" he barked, his calm gone, replaced with the sharp efficiency of a man trained for war. Hank was on his knees, sniper instincts kicking in as he took careful aim through the chaos. He squeezed the trigger, and outside, a body hit the ground. "One down," he muttered. Kane pulled a grenade from his pack and lobbed it through the open window. "Fire in the hole!" The explosion rocked the night, sending a wave of dirt and heat into the house. The gunfire stopped for a brief second, just long enough for Frank to get to his feet and grab his rifle. He could see movement in the darkness, shadows of men shifting behind vehicles, reloading, getting ready for another push. "They're testing us!" Cruz gritted out, pulling his own weapon, "seeing how fast we respond." "Well, they got their answer," Frank growled. More bullets tore through the air. Frank took cover behind the doorway, steadying his breath. He counted 3 men moving toward the barn, weapons drawn. If they got inside, they'd burn the whole damn place down. "Ghost, you got a shot?" "Not yet." Frank didn't wait. He sprinted through the back door, cutting through the dark like a shadow. He kept low, moving fast, his rifle held steady. The men near the barn didn't see him coming. They were too focused on their approach. Frank dropped the first one with a clean shot to the chest. The second turned, but Frank was faster. He fired again, the crack of his rifle splitting the night. The third man panicked, firing wildly before ducking behind a barrel. Bo's shotgun roared from the house, sending another cartel soldier into the dirt. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, the kind of silence that only comes when the dead are settling into the earth. Frank exhaled, his pulse a steady thud in his ears. The bodies around him weren't the first he had ever put down, and they wouldn't be the last. Back inside, the others were regrouping. Cruz checked Hank's shoulder, where a bullet had grazed him. "Lucky bastard," Cruz muttered, slapping a bandage over the wound. Hank just smirked. "Told you I don't die easy." Ghost was already back on his laptop, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "They pulled back for now, but they'll be back," he said, "and they'll bring more." Kane wiped blood off his cheek with the back of his hand. "Then we don't wait for them. We take the fight to them." Frank didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, at the bullet holes in the walls, at the blood on the floor, at the men who had come back to fight alongside him. He knew Kane was right. "They think we're just some old war dogs past our prime," Frank finally said. "Let's show 'em what happens when you back a wolf into a corner." The others nodded, their expressions hard, resolute. No more waiting, no more defending. No, it was time to hunt. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the land as Frank Callahan walked the perimeter of his property, his boots crunching against the dry soil. The stench of gunpowder still clung to the air, a grim reminder of the night before. Bullet holes scarred the walls of his house. The barn had taken a few hits, but the worst damage had been to the silence. His land had never felt like this before, like prey, waiting for the predator to return. Inside the house, the others were already awake. They had spent the night patching up wounds, cleaning weapons, and taking turns watching the road for any sign of movement. None of them spoke much, but there was no need. They all knew what was coming. Frank entered the kitchen to find Kane and Bo arguing over the coffee pot, both looking like men who had been awake for too long. Cruz sat at the table, rolling his shoulder and wincing at the stiffness, while Ghost was hunched over his laptop, his fingers moving fast. "They'll be back," Ghost said without looking up. "They pulled out fast, but not because they were scared. That was just a recon squad. Mendoza doesn't waste men, not unless he's measuring how hard a target is to crack." Frank poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter. "How long we got?" "Hours, maybe a day," Ghost replied. "They're regrouping, and they know we're not just some farmers playing soldier." Frank set his cup down and turned to the others. "Then we don't sit around waiting for them. We make this place a fortress." Kane grinned. "Now you're speaking my language." They got to work. Bo and Cruz reinforced the doors and windows with steel plates, salvaged from the old storage shed behind the barn. They rigged motion sensors around the property, old tech but reliable, and Kane spent the better part of the morning wiring explosives in key areas, places they could funnel the cartel into if things got ugly. "Don't step past that tree," Kane warned, pointing at a barely visible wire stretched across the dirt. "Unless you want to learn how to fly." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good work." The sniper's nest took the longest. They converted the second floor of the barn into an overwatch position, with Hank setting up his rifle and lining up shots through a scope that hadn't been used in years. He adjusted the bipod, took a deep breath, and tested the wind with an old habit that hadn't left him. "This reminds me of that one mission in Kandahar," Hank muttered. "The one where you almost got us killed?" Ghost said dryly. Hank smirked. "That's not how I remember it." Frank left them to their work and saddled up Ghost for a ride along the far fence line. The Mustang huffed, restless from the tension that had soaked into the land. Frank patted the animal's neck as they moved along the outer edge of the property, scanning the distance for anything that didn't belong. Then he saw it. Tracks. Fresh tire marks in the dirt, just beyond the tree line. Someone had been there, watching, probably within the last hour. Frank dismounted, running a hand through the loose soil, feeling the weight of the realization settle in his gut. They weren't just coming back. They were already here. He rode back hard and fast, dust kicking up in thick clouds behind him. The others saw him coming and met him at the barn, their hands already on their weapons. "They're scouting us," Frank said, dismounting. "Got fresh tracks near the south fence. They're checking for weaknesses." Ghost shut his laptop and stood. "Then we tighten up." They spent the rest of the day reinforcing weak points, stacking sandbags, digging trenches where needed. Cruz set up a medical station inside the house, laying out bandages, stitching kits, and whatever else he could scrounge up. "I'm gonna need more supplies," he muttered, taking stock. Frank glanced toward town. "I'll make a run." Ghost shook his head. "They're watching the roads, Frank. If they see you leaving, they'll know we're short on something." "I'll take the back trails," Frank said. "Ghost, come with me. The rest of you stay here." They took an old dirt road that cut through the hills, sticking to the trees where the cover was thickest. The ride into town was slow, careful. By the time they reached the outskirts, the sun was sinking lower, washing the sky in gold and deep red. Frank pulled his hat lower as he and Ghost walked into the general store. The clerk, a wiry man in his 60s named Earl, looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting when he saw Frank. "Heard about what happened last night," Earl said quietly. "You kicking a hornet's nest out there?" Frank set a list on the counter. "Just picking up supplies." Earl read the list, then met Frank's eyes. "Mendoza's got men in town. 2 of them came in earlier asking about you." Frank kept his face neutral. "That so?" Earl nodded toward the back window. "Black SUV parked down the road. Haven't moved in the last hour." Frank didn't look. He didn't need to. He knew they were being watched. Ghost stepped up beside him, his voice low. "We get what we need and leave." Earl started bagging supplies, his movements quick but careful. "You boys be careful out there. Town's got a way of turning on people who bring trouble." "We didn't bring trouble," Frank said. "It came to us." They left through the back door, moving fast through the alley. Ghost checked the road ahead, his sharp eyes catching movement near the SUV. 2 men were leaning against the vehicle, smoking, watching. Ghost touched Frank's arm. "They're waiting to see where we go." Frank sighed. "Then let's not disappoint 'em." They didn't run. They didn't rush. They walked straight past the SUV, giving the men nothing but a glance. It was a test, a way to see if Mendoza's men would make a move in broad daylight. They didn't. Not yet. But Frank could feel it, thick in the air. The storm was coming. By the time they made it back to the farm, the others were already waiting. The tension in the air was suffocating, but there was no fear in their eyes, only resolve. Frank tossed the supplies to Cruz, then turned to the others. "They know we're dug in," he said. "They're watching the roads. Next time, they're not coming for a warning." Bo cracked his neck. "Good. I was getting bored." Frank looked at the faces around him. These men weren't just here for revenge or for a fight. They were here because they knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about standing ground. He glanced up at the sky, at the last traces of daylight disappearing over the horizon. He had spent his life preparing for war. and war had finally come home. The night air was thick with the smell of sweat and gun oil as Frank Callahan sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his lap. The others were spread out across the property, some sleeping in shifts, others keeping watch. The farm had transformed in the last 24 hours from a quiet retreat into something else entirely. A battlefield waiting for the first shots to be fired. Ghost had rigged a network of motion sensors across the property, feeding data into a laptop he had set up in the kitchen. Kane had spent the evening planting explosives in the choke points, low enough to avoid detection, but powerful enough to rip through whatever poor bastard thought they were walking into an easy fight. Hank had already set up his sniper nest, his rifle sight trained on the road leading to the farm. Frank exhaled slowly, watching the tree line, waiting for something, anything. He could feel it in his bones. The fight was getting closer. Inside, Cruz was rummaging through a medical kit, muttering under his breath, "We're gonna need more supplies. If things go south, I'm not stitching you assholes up with duct tape." Bo leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping a beer. "What, you don't think duct tape can stop a bullet?" Cruz shot him a look. "It can, but you're not gonna like it." Ghost's voice cut through the room, calm and steady. "We have a problem." Frank walked inside, finding Ghost staring at his laptop screen. "Cartel." "Worse," Ghost muttered. "Cops." Frank felt his stomach tighten. "What?" Ghost turned the screen toward him. "Sheriff's office radio chatter. They're moving on us." "Son of a bitch," Kane muttered. "We're about to be fugitives." Hank walked in, wiping his hands on his pants. "Sheriff's department ain't got the manpower for this. They're not coming on their own." Ghost nodded. "They're bought. Mendoza must have sent a message up the chain. We're not just fighting the cartel anymore." Frank stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He had expected Mendoza to send more men, expected them to come in force. What he hadn't expected was law enforcement getting involved this early. Bo slammed his beer down. "So, what's the play? We shoot at cops, we're done. Even if we live through it, they'll hunt us until we're dead." Frank ran a hand down his face. "We don't fire first. We let them make the move, but if they come in shooting, we put them down." Ghost tapped the keyboard, switching the feed to a nearby traffic camera. "Black SUVs, 2 sheriff cruisers. That's what's heading this way." Frank felt a cold rage settle in his chest. Mendoza had turned this into a two-front war. The cartel would hit them head-on, and the law would make sure there was nowhere to run. The distant sound of engines carried through the night. "They're here," Hank muttered. Frank stood up, grabbing his rifle. "Everybody outside." They moved fast, slipping into the darkness like ghosts, positioning themselves along the fence line and behind the barn. Frank stayed on the porch, watching the headlights cut through the night, the sound of tires rolling to a slow stop. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up first, followed by a black SUV. Another cruiser stopped just behind it. 3 men stepped out. 2 in uniform, 1 in a dark suit. Frank recognized the sheriff, Tom Wheeler, a man who had spent the last 10 years doing as little as possible. The man in the suit was someone else entirely. "Callahan!" Wheeler called out. "Step forward!" Frank walked down the steps, his rifle slung over his shoulder but his hand never far from it. "Sheriff." Wheeler looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You know why we're here." Frank tilted his head. "I'm sure you're about to tell me." The man in the suit spoke. "Mendoza wants this to end peacefully. You pack up and leave, there's no problem." Frank looked him over. "You FBI?" The man smiled. "Something like that." Frank exhaled slowly. "I ain't leaving." The man sighed. "We figured you'd say that." The moment he said it, Frank saw movement behind the vehicles. More men stepping out. Not cops. Gunmen. Frank didn't hesitate. He dropped low, swinging his rifle up just as the first shot rang out. He fired, hitting the first cartel enforcer square in the chest before rolling behind the nearest stack of sandbags. The farm exploded into chaos. Hank's sniper rifle cracked from the barn, sending one of the gunmen spinning onto the ground. Kane's explosives blew out the tires of the SUV, sending it skidding sideways. Bo let loose with his shotgun, shattering the windshield of a cruiser. The sheriff scrambled back toward his car, cursing, "God damn it, stand down!" The cartel didn't listen. More shots tore through the air. Frank fired back, his rounds finding their marks. Cruz dragged one of the wounded behind cover, already working to stop the bleeding. A voice screamed over the radio, "Get the hell out of here!" The sheriff's department bailed. The moment they realized this wasn't a normal raid, they took off, leaving Mendoza's men to fend for themselves. Ghost was already moving, his silencer whispering death as he dropped another cartel soldier near the fence line. Then it was over. Silence. Frank stood slowly, scanning the battlefield. The sheriff's men were gone. The cartel was dead or dying. Ghost wiped the sweat from his brow. That was close. Frank looked at the bodies sprawled across his land. Too close. Kane chuckled. "Well, the good news is, we don't have to worry about the sheriff anymore." Frank wasn't so sure. Mendoza had tried to end this quietly. That hadn't worked. Now he was going to send everything he had, and Frank planned to be ready. The bodies were still warm when Frank Callahan stood over them. His boots darkened with the dirt kicked up from the fight. The sheriff's men were gone, but the cartel's soldiers lay where they had fallen, their weapons scattered in the dust. The air smelled of gunpowder, blood, and the faint acrid stink of burning oil from the SUV Kane had blown to hell. Ghost was already searching the bodies, moving with the precision of a man who had done this too many times before. He patted down pockets, checked weapons, and took anything useful. He worked in silence, the only sound the occasional click of a magazine being removed or a radio being disabled. Bo stood near the barn, reloading his shotgun with a methodical slowness, his jaw clenched tight. "That was a damn welcoming committee," he muttered. "Mendoza ain't playing games anymore." Kane nudged one of the dead men with the toe of his boot. "No, but he still underestimated us. Thought he could send some muscle with a badge and scare us off." He glanced up at Frank. "He's going to come heavier next time." Frank already knew that. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about pride. The cartel had thrown its weight around for years, making examples of men who stood in their way. But now Mendoza had a problem. Frank hadn't folded. He had fought back. That wasn't something a man like Mendoza could let slide. Cruz was crouched beside one of the wounded, pressing a bloodied rag against the man's shoulder. The guy wasn't cartel, at least not a soldier. He was one of the sheriff's men, maybe even local. His face was pale from blood loss, his breaths ragged. Cruz looked up at Frank. "He's not going to last long without help." Frank studied the wounded man. Could have been one of the guys who came to haul him away in cuffs. Could have been just another pawn in Mendoza's game. But he was still a man bleeding out in the dirt. Frank exhaled through his nose. "Patch him up." Cruz gave a short nod and kept working. Ghost stood, holding a black burner phone in his gloved hand. "Found something interesting," he said. Frank took the phone and flipped it open. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. A message was left unread. 3 words, "Call me, now." And then, as if the universe was waiting for him to read it, the phone rang. The men around him tensed. Ghost pulled a suppressed pistol from his belt, shifting slightly to scan the tree line. Bo tightened his grip on his shotgun. Hank remained still, watching, waiting. Frank let the phone ring twice before answering. He didn't say anything. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, and carried a weight of certainty that came from knowing you controlled everything you touched. "Senor Callahan," Frank remained silent, a small chuckle. "If you are holding this phone, then you already know who I am." Frank exhaled through his nose. "Mendoza. You are not a man easily intimidated," Mendoza continued, as if they were having a casual conversation over coffee. "I respect that." Frank's grip tightened around the phone. "I don't need your respect." "You need something," Mendoza said. "Otherwise you would have walked away already." Frank glanced at the dead men around him. "I don't run." "Then you are a fool," Mendoza said, not unkindly. "But fools can be useful when they know their place." Frank didn't answer. "I want what you have," Mendoza continued, his voice like silk wrapped around steel. "I want your land. I want it because it is perfect for what I need. Its location, its seclusion. It is valuable, more valuable than you realize." Frank already knew this wasn't just about property. The farm sat on a stretch of land that had been ignored for years, except by men who understood how to move things under the right conditions. The roads were old, unmonitored, with just enough tree cover to keep prying eyes away. It was a smuggler's dream. Mendoza let the silence stretch before speaking again. "I am a businessman, Senor Callahan. You have been a soldier long enough to know that war is bad for business. I am offering you a way out. One time, one chance." Frank looked toward the house where the others were waiting. He knew they were listening, reading his body language, waiting for his decision. "I don't deal with murderers," Frank said. Mendoza chuckled. "Oh, but you do. You have already killed my men. You have already drawn blood. And yet, here I am, still offering you a way to walk away from this." Frank's jaw clenched. "Not interested." Another chuckle. "Of course not. Not yet." A pause. "You are an old man, Callahan. You have already lost more than most. How much more can you afford to lose?" Frank's fingers tightened around the phone. "You come here again. I'll bury every last one of you." Mendoza sighed, like a parent disappointed in a stubborn child. "Then you leave me no choice." The line went dead. Frank closed the phone and tossed it onto the ground. For a long moment, no one spoke. The night stretched around them, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. Bo let out a low whistle. "Well, that went about as good as expected," Kane smirked. "I liked the part where you threatened to bury them all." Ghost rubbed his chin. "He's not done. That was his way of telling us he's going to escalate." Hank slung his rifle over his shoulder. "Then we escalate first." Frank ran a hand down his face, feeling the exhaustion creep in. He hadn't wanted this war, but it was his now. There was no running from it. "We need supplies," Cruz said, standing up. "More than we have. If we're going to hold this place, we need ammo, medical gear, food. We need to plan for a siege." Frank nodded. "We take shifts. Rest while you can." He turned to Ghost. "You keep watching the roads. If Mendoza moves, I want to know before he gets here." Ghost nodded once and walked back toward the house. Kane stretched, cracking his knuckles. "Guess we're really doing this." Bo grinned. "Damn right we are." Frank took one last look at the bodies in the dirt, then up at the stars. They had one chance to make a stand, and he'd be damned if he let Mendoza take one more thing from him. The night stretched long and heavy, the silence thick with the kind of tension that sat in a man's gut and refused to let go. Frank Callahan sat on his porch, the weight of his rifle familiar against his lap. The others had taken turns sleeping, but Frank hadn't closed his eyes. The last conversation with Mendoza still played in his head, looping over and over. There was no misunderstanding, no negotiating. Mendoza had made it clear he was coming, and he wasn't coming to talk. Hank was up in the barn's sniper nest, his rifle resting on a sandbag, one eye locked to the scope. Ghost was inside, monitoring the road cameras he had set up, his fingers moving across the keyboard in near silence. Bo had posted himself behind an overturned truck near the gate, a belt-fed machine gun mounted on the hood. Kane was checking his explosives for the third time, making sure everything was in place. Frank sipped at his coffee, black and bitter. He had lost the taste for whiskey long ago, but he needed something to keep him sharp. The sky was clear, a million stars overhead, but the land felt wrong, too still, too quiet. Then Ghost's voice cut through the silence from inside the house. "Movement." Frank stood, the others reacting instantly. Bo shifted behind the truck, checking the sights on his gun. Kane melted into the shadows, disappearing behind the barn. Hank adjusted his position. Frank stepped inside, standing behind Ghost as the laptop screen showed a grainy, black-and-white image of the road leading up to the farm. 2 vehicles, headlights off, slow approach. Mendoza's men weren't coming in like they were looking for a conversation. Ghost exhaled. "It's starting." Frank grabbed the radio. "Everyone in position." The truck reached the first checkpoint, a narrow gap between the hills where Kane had planted explosives. It slowed, then stopped. Frank knew what was happening. They were waiting, listening. Mendoza's men were smart. They weren't going to roll in blind. A figure stepped out of the first truck, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Another emerged from the second vehicle. Two more followed. They moved slow, calculated. These weren't reckless gangbangers looking for a fight. These were men who had done this before. Hank's voice crackled over the radio. "They're spreading out." Frank watched the screen. They were testing the perimeter, looking for weaknesses. He clicked the radio. "Let 'em, don't engage until I say." One of the men reached the first tripwire. A thin line stretched between two posts, barely visible in the dark. Frank could see it coming, could already hear the explosion in his head before it happened. Then the man took one more step. The explosion rocked the night, fire and dirt erupting into the air. The blast sent the closest gunman flying back, his body tumbling over the gravel like a rag doll. The others scrambled, dropping to the ground, weapons snapping up toward the barn. Then Hank fired. The first shot hit home, dropping one of Mendoza's men before he could even react. The second shot hit another, punching clean through his chest. Bo opened up next, the machine gun roaring to life, tearing through the thin metal of the cartel's trucks. Rounds ripped into the doors, shattering windows, blowing holes in the engine block. The cartel fired back, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness. Bullets pinged off the barn, dug into the dirt, splintered wood. Kane detonated another charge, sending a plume of fire and smoke into the air. Frank moved fast, his rifle tight against his shoulder as he fired off two quick shots, dropping another enemy behind the burning truck. Cruz was already moving, keeping low, dragging a wounded cartel soldier behind cover. The enemy was pinned, outmatched. Frank could hear their shouts in Spanish, could hear the panic creeping into their voices. Mendoza's men weren't expecting this. They thought they were going to roll in and take the farm without much trouble. They had thought wrong. Then Frank saw him, a lone figure moving through the trees, separate from the others. He was smart, avoiding open ground, keeping low, a silencer screwed onto the end of his rifle. A professional. Frank lined up the shot, exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The round caught the man in the throat. He went down without a sound. Another explosion rocked the night. Kane had set off a second trap, catching two more in the blast. The few survivors that remained scrambled, trying to retreat, dragging their wounded with them. Then, just like that, it was over. The silence returned, broken only by the crackle of fire and the groans of the dying. Frank exhaled. Lowering his rifle, he could see the bodies now, scattered in the dirt. The trucks were ruined, Mendoza's men either dead or retreating. Ghost stood from his position inside, stepping onto the porch. "They're falling back." Frank clicked the radio. "Hank?" "Still watching," Hank replied. "No movement." "No. Looks like they're done." Bo chuckled. "Damn, that was quick." Kane emerged from the barn, wiping the sweat from his brow. "They weren't ready for us." Frank nodded, but he wasn't smiling. This wasn't the end. Mendoza had underestimated them tonight, but that wouldn't happen again. He would come back harder, angrier, with more men, more weapons. Cruz finished tying off a bandage on one of the wounded cartel men. "This one's gonna live," he said. "Might be able to get something out of him." Frank looked down at the man, blood dripping from his shoulder. He was young, too young, barely more than a kid, the kind of soldier Mendoza used as cannon fodder. The kid looked up, his dark eyes filled with pain and defiance. He spat on the ground near Frank's boot. "You're dead," he rasped. "You don't know it yet, but you are." Frank crouched down, meeting his gaze. "Tell Mendoza," he said, his voice low and even. "Tell him to send more men, as many as he wants." He stood, stepping back, "and tell him I'll bury every single one of them." The kid didn't say anything else. Ghost exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Mendoza's gonna be pissed." Bo smirked. "Good. Let him be." Frank glanced at the bodies. The first battle was over, but the war had just begun. Mendoza had tested them. Now it was time to show him what real war looked like. He turned to the others. "We hit back at dawn." The sun had barely begun its slow crawl over the horizon. when Frank Callahan stood at the edge of his land, staring down at the blood-soaked dirt. The bodies of Mendoza's men had been removed, but their presence still lingered like the acrid stench of gunpowder. His farm had always been a place of solitude, of quiet mornings and honest work, but now it had become a battlefield. He had no illusions about what came next. Mendoza had underestimated them once, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. He'd be sending more men, better men. The next fight wouldn't be a test, it would be an execution. Bo walked up beside him, dragging a shovel behind him, his shirt already stained with sweat. "I don't mind digging graves, Frank, but you keep stacking bodies like this, and I'm going to need a damn bulldozer." Frank didn't respond right away. His mind was too busy running calculations, trying to stay ahead of the storm that was coming. Kane joined them, wiping the grime from his face. Ghost got a hit on Mendoza's comms. "Bastard's pissed." Frank finally turned, his eyes narrowing. "How bad?" Kane sighed. "Bad enough that he's bringing in something different this time. His own personal squad. Not just cartel grunts, Frank. These are the kind of guys that don't leave witnesses." Frank knew what that meant. Mendoza had his enforcers, the ones who made examples of people, the ones that didn't just kill, but made statements, and those men were now coming for him. Ghost stepped onto the porch, laptop in hand. Intercepted some chatter. They're moving a full unit down from the border, armed to the teeth. They're not rolling in blind this time. This isn't retaliation, it's eradication. Bo scoffed, loading shells into his shotgun. "Let 'em come. I got enough lead for every one of them." Ghost shook his head. "This isn't the same as last night. These aren't disposable soldiers. They're professionals. They'll come fast, hard, and without hesitation." Frank took a slow breath, staring at the land that had been his home for years. "Then we don't fight them here." Kane raised an eyebrow. "You suggesting we just pack up and run?" Frank's voice was calm, measured. "No. I'm suggesting we hit first." A beat of silence followed. Then Hank chuckled from the barn loft, where he had been listening. "Now you're talking." Frank turned toward the others. "We need to take the fight to them before they bring it to us. That means hitting their supply routes, disrupting their comms, making sure Mendoza knows that we're not the ones running." Ghost nodded. "I've got their staging point. Small warehouse on the edge of town. Looks like they've been moving weapons and men through there for weeks." Frank tightened his grip on his rifle. "Then that's where we go." The plan was simple. Hit them before they could regroup. A full frontal assault would be suicide, but a precise strike, that could work. The team loaded up, weapons checked and ready. They had fought enough wars to know that the only way to win was to be smarter, meaner, and faster than the enemy. By midday, they were on the road. Frank drove, Ghost in the passenger seat with a small radio intercept kit. Bo and Kane in the back, weapons loaded and ready. Cruz followed in a separate vehicle, Hank riding shotgun, a scoped rifle across his lap. The warehouse was nothing special, just another forgotten building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence. It looked quiet from the outside, but Ghost had already confirmed what lay within. 6 men inside, Ghost reported. Another 3 outside, armed. They're expecting someone, but not us. Frank pulled the truck to a stop a quarter-mile out. We hit hard and fast. No time for drawn-out fights. We take what we can, leave nothing for them to use. Kane smirked. "You just gave me permission to blow shit up, Frank. I appreciate that." Frank shook his head. "Keep it controlled." They moved in silence, cutting through the field toward the warehouse. The wind carried the faint scent of diesel, mixing with the dry heat. As they neared the fence, Frank held up a hand, signaling for the others to hold. 2 cartel guards stood near the entrance, smoking, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. They weren't paying attention. Ghost whispered, "I'll take the one on the left." Frank nodded. 2 silent shots cracked through the air, barely louder than snapping twigs. Both guards dropped before they even knew they were dead. They moved forward. Inside, the warehouse was filled with crates, guns, ammo, drugs. Everything Mendoza needed to keep his operation running. Frank signaled to Kane, who immediately set to work rigging explosives along the walls. Ghost was already at the makeshift control station. downloading files from an old computer. "We hit a gold mine," he whispered. "Routes, supply chains, Mendoza's network. It's all here." Frank moved through the warehouse, checking corners, making sure none of Mendoza's men were left breathing. Bo stood over a half-conscious cartel soldier, his face unreadable. Frank stepped closer. "Alive!" Bo shrugged. "For now." The man coughed, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth, his eyes locked onto Frank. "You think this will stop him?" he rasped. Frank kneeled down, gripping the man's collar. "No," he admitted, "but it'll piss him off." With a sharp motion, he sent the man into unconsciousness with a single blow to the temple. "We're done here," Kane called out, finishing the last charge. "Ticking clock, Frank." They moved fast, slipping back into the trees. As soon as they were clear, Kane pressed the detonator. The explosion tore through the warehouse, sending a column of fire into the sky. The shock wave rolled across the land, shaking the very ground beneath them. Frank watched the destruction for a moment, then turned away. "That sends a message." Ghost adjusted his radio, and here comes the reply. Static filled the air for a second before a voice cut through. Mendoza. His voice was calm, but beneath it there was fury. "Senor Callahan, you are making a mistake." Frank grabbed the radio. "You already made yours." Silence. Then Mendoza spoke again, his voice dripping with promise. "You will beg before the end." The line went dead. Frank tossed the radio into the dirt. He already knew what was coming next. Mendoza wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to send men in waves anymore. He was coming himself, and Frank would be waiting. The road back to the farm was quiet, but there was no peace in it. The weight of what they had done settled in the truck like an unspoken force, pressing down on the men. The warehouse was gone. Mendoza's weapons, his supplies, his network, all of it up in flames. But Mendoza hadn't built his empire by letting men walk away from that kind of insult. He was going to come, and now there was no doubt he would bring everything he had. Frank Callahan kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on his rifle. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel too hard, but he didn't care. He was already thinking ahead, the next move, the next fight. Bo was the first to break the silence. "So what's the plan, Frank? We just sit back and wait for the devil to knock on the front door?" Frank didn't take his eyes off the road. "No, we make sure the door crushes him when he walks in." Ghost leaned forward from the back seat, scanning the road behind them. "They'll come fast. Might even have men waiting for us before we get back." Frank nodded. "Then we dig in. Make it so every step they take onto my land is a mistake." They hit the dirt road leading up to the farm, kicking up dust in thick clouds behind them. As soon as the truck skidded to a stop in front of the house, the men moved fast. Hank was already heading to his sniper nest. Cruz was pulling out medical supplies, and Kane was grinning like a man who had just been given permission to be his worst self. "You got something for me, Frank?" Kane asked, hands already twitching toward his explosives bag. Frank pointed toward the outer fence line. "I want traps, the kind that take men apart. If they get past that, I want more inside." Kane's grin widened. "Now you're speaking my language." Ghost was already setting up in the house, feeding data through his laptop, listening in on cartel radio chatter. "They're mobilizing," he muttered. "Fast. Mendoza's furious. He's calling in every favor he's got." Frank pulled a chair over, staring at the screen. "How many?" Ghost exhaled. "More than we've got bullets for." Bo let out a low whistle. "Then we better make our shots count." Frank stood. "We make this farm a fortress. Kane, you handle explosives. Bo, you reinforce the gates. Cruz, get medical supplies ready. Hank, you already know what to do." Hank's voice crackled over the radio from the barn loft. "They won't make it past the first shot." Frank turned to Ghost. "I need you listening. The second Mendoza's men make a move, I want to know before they do." Ghost gave a small nod. "They're coming. And they're coming soon." The men worked fast, and the land changed with them. The outer fences were reinforced with tripwires, hidden explosives, and steel reinforcements that turned the open fields into a kill zone. The barn was turned into a fortress, sandbags and steel plating reinforcing the walls. Inside the house, Cruz set up a triage area. He laid out bandages, sutures, painkillers. There was no denying what was coming. Not everyone was going to walk away from this fight. As night fell, Frank stood outside the house, staring at the darkened horizon. The wind carried the distant sound of approaching engines. Mendoza's men were moving. Ghost stepped onto the porch, holding his radio. They're gathering south of the ridge, at least 15 trucks. More on the way. Frank didn't react. Then let's make sure they regret it. The night stretched long and quiet. The men took shifts, watching, waiting. Every so often the distant headlights of cartel scouts flickered along the tree line, but none came close. Mendoza was waiting. Frank sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, his fingers tracing the wood grain. He had spent years trying to build something here, something real, and now men he had never met were coming to burn it all down. Kane walked up, dropping into the chair beside him. Hell of a way to spend retirement, huh? Frank smirked. I never planned on retiring. Bo joined them, cracking open a beer. You think we make it through this? Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at his land, the place he had fought to call home. I think we make them bleed for every inch of it. Bo grinned. That's all I needed to hear. The sound of an approaching vehicle made them all tense. Ghost was already moving toward the radio, checking feeds. It's just one, he muttered. Black SUV, not part of the main group. Frank stood, gripping his rifle. They're sending a message. The SUV rolled to a stop just beyond the outer gate. The engine idled for a moment. Then the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, alone. Even in the dim moonlight, Frank recognized him instantly. Mateo Rojas, Mendoza's enforcer, the same man who had stood on Frank's porch a week ago, issuing threats like they were worth something. Rojas held his hands up, palms out. I come to talk. Frank didn't lower his rifle. You're wasting your breath. Rojas smirked. I don't think so. My boss is a reasonable man. He doesn't want a war. Frank took a slow step forward. Then he shouldn't have started one. Rojas sighed, shaking his head. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Callahan. He gestured toward the fields. You think you can hold this place? Think you can fight off what's coming? Frank didn't blink. I don't think I know, Rojas chuckled. You know what I think. I think you're just another old man who doesn't realize the world's changed. You think you're still fighting some righteous war, but you're not. You're just standing in the way of progress. Frank took another step forward, his voice low and steady. You got two choices, Rojas. Get back in that truck and drive away, or I put you in the dirt right here. Rojas stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right. He turned, walking back toward the SUV. But just as he reached the door, he looked over his shoulder. Mendoza doesn't leave loose ends. You know that, right? Frank didn't answer. Rojas smirked. See you soon, Callahan. The SUV rolled back down the dirt road, disappearing into the darkness. Bo exhaled. That guy's got a real punchable face. Frank turned back toward the house. Get some rest. Hank's voice came through the radio. Oh, won't be long now. Frank nodded. No, it won't. They had set the trap. Now they just had to wait for Mendoza to walk into it. The night stretched on, thick and heavy, as Frank Callahan sat in the living room of his house, staring at the map spread across the table. The others were stationed at their posts, Hank in the barn's sniper nest, Ghost monitoring the roads from his laptop, Bo and Kane securing the last of the explosives, and Cruz checking the medical supplies one last time. They all knew what was coming. There was no more guessing, no more hoping that Mendoza would see reason. Rojas had come to deliver his final warning. Now it was just a matter of time before the real fight began. Frank stood, stretching his stiff back, and stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was crisp, but the stillness carried something else with it, a waiting, a breath held too long before the storm. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years, and took a slow drag. Ghost's voice crackled through the radio from inside. Movement on the South Road. 3 vehicles. Frank exhaled smoke through his nose. Scouts? Probably. They're keeping their distance. But they're watching. Frank keyed the radio. Hank? From the barn loft, Hank's voice came back, calm and steady. Got eyes on 'em. They're not making a move. Yet. Frank watched the dark horizon. Mendoza wasn't rushing in. He was waiting for the right moment to strike, letting the tension build like a coiled spring. He wasn't just sending men to fight. He was planning an execution. Ghost came out onto the porch, arms crossed. He's making us sweat. Frank took another drag from his cigarette. Ain't working. Bo and Kane walked up from the barn, both checking their weapons. Bo let out a low chuckle. Hell, I wish they'd just get to it already. I hate waiting. Kane grinned. Patience, big guy. We want them to come in hot, thinking they're in control. Ghost's radio beeped. A new voice cut through. Callahan? It was Rojas. Frank took the radio from Ghost's hand. You got something to say. Rojas' voice was smooth, almost casual. Just thought I'd check in. We're close now. Frank could hear the engine noise behind him. They weren't just watching. They were coming. You still have a chance, Rojas continued. Mendoza's willing to let you walk away. All you have to do is leave. Frank flicked his cigarette into the dirt. That ain't happening. Rojas sighed. Then you leave us no choice. The radio went dead. Ghost tapped his keyboard, switching camera feeds. They're moving. Frank turned to the others. Get to your positions. The night exploded with light. The first truck came roaring down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the darkness, engines screaming. A second followed, then a third, more vehicles rolling in behind them. The cartel wasn't sending another scouting party. This was an assault. Hank's rifle cracked from the barn. The driver of the lead truck slumped forward and the vehicle veered off course, flipping over as it slammed into a ditch. Bo's machine gun roared to life from behind the truck barricade, tearing into the convoy, sending cartel gunmen scrambling for cover. Kane detonated the first set of explosives, blowing apart the road behind them, cutting off any chance of retreat. The farm had become a war zone. Frank crouched behind a stack of sandbags, firing shot after shot, dropping a cartel enforcer who had made it too close to the fence. Cruz was inside, tending to Hank's shoulder. He had taken a grazing shot, but he was still in the fight. Ghost's voice came through the radio. More coming in from the north! Frank cursed under his breath. They were flanking. Mendoza wasn't throwing men at the front gate. He was spreading them out, looking for weaknesses. Kane, with me! Frank shouted, sprinting toward the north fence line. They moved fast, cutting through the trees, their boots kicking up dust. The north road was barely visible in the moonlight, but Frank could see them. Another group of cartel gunmen moving low, trying to push through the fence line. Kane raised his rifle. We lighting them up? Frank nodded. Now. The two men opened fire, cutting down the first wave before they could react. A cartel soldier lobbed a Molotov cocktail over the fence, flames bursting to life along the dry grass. They're trying to burn us out, Kane growled. Frank keyed his radio. Bo, get those fires out before they spread. Bo didn't answer right away, but soon enough the sound of a fire extinguisher hissed over the chaos. More gunfire erupted from the barn. Hank was still picking them off, but the cartel was moving smarter now, using cover, pushing in close. Frank reloaded. Frank, his hands steady, despite the storm raging around him. He had been in worse fights, seen worse odds. But this wasn't some foreign war. This was his land, his home. Another explosion rocked the night as Kane set off another trap, sending cartel men flying. Ghost's voice came through again. They're pulling back. Frank wiped sweat from his forehead. All of them. Ghost hesitated. Not all. Some are holding back, waiting. They're testing us again, Kane muttered. Frank stared at the burning wreckage, at the bodies scattered across his land. Mendoza had lost men tonight, but this wasn't the final attack. This was just another probe, another attempt to break them. They'll regroup, Frank said. They'll come back. Kane scoffed. Good. I was getting worried they might give up. Frank didn't smile. He knew what Mendoza was doing. The cartel leader wasn't looking for a simple victory. He wanted to break them, to make them run, to make them beg. But Frank Callahan had never begged in his life. He keyed the radio again. "Everyone check in." Cruz's voice came first. "Few scrapes, but we're still here." Bo chimed in. "One bullet in my vest. Bastard hit me square in the chest. I owe him a thank you bullet." Hank's voice was sharp. "I'm still up. Took one in the shoulder, but I can still shoot." Ghost was last. "We held, but they'll be back." Frank exhaled. The night was over, but the war wasn't. He turned to the others, his voice steady. "We dig in deeper. We make this place a nightmare for them." Bo grinned. "Hell yeah." Kane wiped his hands on his pants. "What's next?" Frank looked at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were creeping over the land. Mendoza wasn't done. He was still out there planning his next move, but Frank had been planning too. Next time, they weren't going to wait for Mendoza to come to them. Next time, they were going to take the fight to him. The sun rose slow and heavy, casting long streaks of gold across the battered land. Smoke still curled from the wreckage of the night's battle, the air thick with the metallic scent of spent ammunition and burning oil. Frank Callahan stood in the middle of his yard, scanning the horizon. Mendoza wasn't done. The bastard had sent a wave to weaken them, to test them. Now came the real war. Bo stomped out a smoldering patch of grass with his boot, cursing under his breath. This was just round one. Kane sat on an overturned crate, wiping sweat from his face, his rifle across his lap. "Yeah, and I don't think we scared 'em off." Frank exhaled through his nose. "No, we just pissed 'em off." Ghost leaned against the porch railing, flipping through surveillance footage on his laptop. "We've got chatter on their radios. They're regrouping. This wasn't a retreat, it was a setup. They wanted to gauge our defenses before hitting us with everything." Frank already knew. He had seen it before. This wasn't just a fight for territory anymore. This was personal for Mendoza. He had built his empire by crushing resistance, and Frank had just humiliated him. The next attack wouldn't be measured. It would be pure destruction. Bo cracked his knuckles. "Then let's not wait for 'em." Frank shook his head. "No, we don't have the numbers for an all-out assault. If we try to hit them head-on, we'll get buried." Ghost adjusted his earpiece, listening to the intercepted cartel comms. His eyes darkened. "They're moving." Frank's gut tightened. "How many?" Ghost's fingers danced over the keyboard, switching through different surveillance feeds. "More than before. Trucks, motorcycles, foot soldiers. They're coming in waves." Bo let out a low whistle. "Mendoza's sending the whole damn army." Hank's voice crackled through the radio from his sniper nest in the barn loft. "Then let's make sure they regret it." Frank took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Positions, now." The men moved fast and practiced, slipping into the defenses they had spent the last few days fortifying. The farmhouse had become a fortress. The barn was a sniper's nest, the outer fields lined with traps, explosives, and kill zones. Every angle had been considered. Then the first shots rang out. Hank fired first, dropping a cartel scout before he could get too close. The gunfire echoed across the land, and just like that, the silence shattered. A truck came barreling down the dirt road, its bed loaded with gunmen. Bo's machine gun roared to life, tearing through the vehicle, sending men scrambling for cover as the tires exploded and the truck skidded sideways. Then came the second wave. Gunmen on motorcycles weaved through the chaos, firing blindly as they tried to close the distance. Kane detonated the first set of explosives, the ground erupting in fire and debris, sending bodies flying. The remaining bikers swerved, but Frank and Ghost were already picking them off, their rifles steady. More vehicles followed, skidding to a stop at the outer fence. Cartel soldiers spilled out using the wreckage as cover. The air was alive with gunfire, the night's quiet shattered by the relentless crack of rifles and the deafening thud of grenades. Frank crouched low, squeezing off shots, each bullet finding its mark. He had fought too many battles to waste ammo now. Ghost ducked behind cover, his voice calm despite the chaos. "They're trying to flank us on the west side." Frank keyed his radio. "Hank, already on it," came the reply. A second later, a sniper round tore through the air, and a cartel soldier crumpled mid-sprint. Bo grinned, teeth flashing in the muzzle flare. "Keep bringing 'em, Mendoza." Another explosion ripped through the field as Kane set off another charge, cutting down a squad that had tried to sneak through the tree line. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the shooting slowed. The cartel was pulling back. Frank scanned the battlefield, his rifle still raised. "They're regrouping." Ghost's fingers flew across the keyboard. "They've got something else coming. Hold position." The sound came first, a low, mechanical growl building into a roar. Then Frank saw it. A goddamn armored truck, the cartel's version of a battering ram, reinforced with steel plates, bulletproof glass, and a mounted turret. It rolled forward, slow and steady. Gunmen hunkered down behind it, using it as cover. Bo swore under his breath. "That ain't good." Kane grinned. "You got charges left?" Frank nodded. "Yeah." Kane slung his rifle over his back. "Then cover me." Before anyone could argue, he bolted. Frank, Bo, and Ghost laid down, suppressing fire as Kane moved, ducking low, staying out of the truck's firing range. He reached the wreckage of the first cartel truck, yanking the bag of remaining explosives from the bed. The armored truck kept rolling, bullets bouncing off its reinforced frame like pebbles against steel. Kane sprinted toward a low ditch near the road, planting the explosives fast. He keyed his radio. "Frank, on your mark." Frank didn't hesitate. "Do it." Kane hit the detonator. The explosion was thunderous, shaking the ground, sending fire and debris into the sky. The armored truck rocked, its wheels lifted from the ground, flipping onto its side. Flames erupted from beneath it, and the cartel gunmen who had been using it as cover were torn apart. Bo whooped. "Hell yeah!" Frank stood, rifle raised. The survivors were retreating. Ghost's voice was quiet. "We did it." Frank exhaled, lowering his weapon. The smoke was thick, the bodies were scattered, but they had held. Then, through the haze, something moved. A figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Rojas. He walked past the wreckage, his suit jacket gone, his shirt stained with dust and blood. He stopped just outside the fence, standing in the middle of the battlefield like he belonged there. Frank raised his rifle. "Don't move," Rojas smiled. "Mendoza sends his regards." Frank tightened his grip. "Tell him to come himself." Rojas chuckled. "Oh, he will." The sound of helicopter blades cut through the air. In the distance, headlights appeared, more vehicles, more men. Mendoza wasn't retreating, he was doubling down. Rojas smirked. This was just the beginning. Frank's stomach turned to stone. Mendoza wasn't just trying to kill them, he was bringing a goddamn war. The distant thrum of helicopter blades grew louder, cutting through the smoke-filled air like an omen. The dust hadn't even settled from the last wave, and already Mendoza was bringing more. Frank Callahan stood his ground, rifle tight against his shoulder, eyes locked on Mateo Rojas. The cartel enforcer stood just outside the fence, smirking like a man who already knew the ending of the story. "You should have taken the deal, Callahan," Rojas said. His voice was calm, like this was just business, like the bodies littering the ground around him didn't matter. Frank didn't lower his weapon. "You should have stayed the hell off my land," Rojas exhaled, tilting his head. "It's not your land anymore. It's Mendoza's." The radio crackled in Frank's ear. Ghost's voice was sharp. "They're bringing in more trucks, more men. And the chopper, that's not just for show." Frank already knew what that meant. The next wave wasn't just another assault, it was the kill shot. Mendoza was done playing. He was coming to erase them. Bo crouched behind a burned-out truck, reloading his machine gun. "What's the play, Frank? We hold or we run?" Frank's grip tightened. "We hold." Kane wiped sweat from his face, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, holding ain't looking too good right now." The first shots came fast. The chopper opened up with a mounted gun, cutting a line of destruction through the dirt, sending debris flying. Frank barely had time to dive behind cover before bullets chewed through the wooden porch, splintering it apart. Hank's sniper rifle cracked from the barn loft, and one of the cartel gunners dropped from the helicopter, his body spinning lifelessly before disappearing into the dust. Ghost's voice came through again. "They've got more pushing in from the west. Too many." Frank looked around, calculating. They had held the line so far, but the numbers were shifting. Every shot fired, every second lost. Mendoza got closer to overwhelming them. Cruz ducked behind the sandbags, pressing a bloody rag to his side. He had taken a hit but kept moving. "I can hold, but we need a fallback plan." Bo gritted his teeth, firing another burst toward the tree line. "There ain't no fallback, man. We either stop them here or we don't stop them at all." More cartel men flooded into the field, using the burning trucks for cover. Kane hit the detonator, and another explosion rocked the ground, sending bodies flying. The screams of the wounded mixed with the relentless gunfire. Frank's rifle was hot in his hands, the magazine running dry. He ducked down, reloading fast. This wasn't just another battle. This was it. Then he heard it. The barn. A different kind of explosion, not one of theirs. The ground shuddered, and Frank turned just in time to see flames licking at the night sky. "Hank!" Frank's voice cracked through the radio. No response. Frank didn't hesitate. He ran, dodging fire, sprinting toward the barn as smoke billowed from the loft. A second explosion sent wood and metal flying. The sniper's nest was gone. Frank scrambled up what remained of the ladder, coughing through the thick smoke. He found Hank on the floor, half covered in debris, blood pooling beneath him. His rifle lay just out of reach, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Hank, stay with me," Frank growled, grabbing him by the vest, dragging him toward the ladder. Hank coughed, blood on his lips. "Told you. Don't die easy." "You're not dying," Frank snarled, hauling him onto his shoulder. The barn creaked, ready to come down. Flames licked at the beams, the heat unbearable. Frank forced himself down the ladder. Hank slung over him like dead weight. He hit the dirt just as the roof caved in behind them. Cruz was there in an instant, taking Hank from Frank's arms, pressing his hands against the wound. "We need to stop the bleeding now," Hank groaned, his face pale, his eyes glassy. "Frank." Frank grabbed his hand. "Stay awake, Hank. You hear me? You stay awake." Hank's grip was weak. "Get him. For me." Then he went still. Cruz worked fast, his hands moving with the speed of a man who had done this before. But Frank saw it. He knew. Hank wasn't going to make it. The world blurred. The gunfire, the shouting, it all faded. Frank felt something break inside him. Not anger, not fear, just something cold. He turned toward the battlefield. The cartel was still coming, still pushing forward, the chopper circling like a vulture. Frank pulled his rifle back up, his breathing slow, his vision narrowing. Bo was reloading, Kane setting another charge, Ghost calling out enemy positions. They were still fighting, still holding the line. Frank clenched his jaw. Hank had given everything for this fight, and now Frank was going to finish it. He keyed his radio. "Bo, Kane, on me." Bo turned, eyes widening. Turned, eyes. "Frank!" Frank's voice was ice. "We're taking the fight to them." Kane cracked his knuckles. "Now you're speaking my language." Frank's boots hit the dirt as he moved, fast and deliberate, cutting through the smoke. Mendoza had sent his best men, but now it was time to show them what a real fight looked like. Bo and Kane flanked him, their weapons raised, their faces set in stone. Ghost covered them from behind, feeding them positions, keeping them one step ahead. The chopper circled back. Frank raised his rifle, aiming at the cockpit. He fired. The bullet punched through the glass. The pilot jerked, the helicopter tilting, spinning. Then it crashed. Flames erupted from the wreckage, lighting up the battlefield. Bo let out a wild laugh. "Hell yeah!" But Frank wasn't done. He moved toward the wreckage, stepping over bodies, ignoring the bullets flying past him. He was looking for one man, and then he saw him, Mateo Rojas, dragging himself from the wreckage, coughing, bleeding. Frank raised his rifle. Rojas looked up, eyes burning with rage and something else. Maybe fear, maybe acceptance. "You don't win this, Callahan!" Rojas spat, blood on his lips. Frank didn't blink. "I already have." He pulled the trigger. Rojas collapsed, his body slumping against the dirt. Silence stretched over the battlefield. The last of Mendoza's men were either dead or running. The air was thick with smoke, fire crackling in the distance. It was over. Frank lowered his rifle, his breath slow and steady. But as he turned back toward the house, his gut twisted. This wasn't over. Mendoza hadn't come, and Frank knew why. Mendoza was waiting for the last move, and Frank was going to give it to him. The fire still burned behind them, smoke twisting into the night sky like a funeral pyre. The wreckage of Mendoza's men lay scattered across the field, their attack broken, their numbers gutted. But Frank Callahan didn't feel like a man who had won a battle. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something worse. He looked down at the body of Mateo Rojas, the man Mendoza had sent to make his life hell. Blood pooled around him, mixing with the dirt. A bullet between the eyes, a clean shot, but it wasn't enough. Mendoza wasn't here, and that meant he wasn't finished. Ghost stepped up beside Frank, his face smudged with dust and sweat. "They're done," he said, voice tight. "What's left of them is either dead or running." We held. Frank didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on Rojas's body. Kane limped over, favoring his right leg. His jeans were torn, blood staining the fabric. He spat into the dirt, looking around at the carnage. "I'd call this a win." Bo grunted, pressing a cloth against a wound on his arm. "Feels like a damn marathon. We got more bodies than bullets left." Cruz was kneeling beside Hank, who was still sprawled near the collapsed barn. The blood had stopped flowing, but the damage was done. Hank's breathing was slow, shallow. His skin had gone pale, his chest barely moving. Cruz looked up, shaking his head. Frank felt the weight press down on his chest, heavy and suffocating. Bo crouched next to Hank, setting his gun down. "Damn it, man. You weren't supposed to go out like this." Hank forced a weak smirk. "Guess I didn't get the memo." Frank knelt down beside him, gripping his hand. "You stay with me, Hank." Hank swallowed, his voice barely more than a breath. "Ain't my choice, Frank." Ghost turned away. Staring at the horizon, his jaw clenched. Kane ran a hand over his face, breathing deep through his nose. Bo let out a bitter laugh. "Hell, Hank! You're supposed to be too stubborn to die." Hank chuckled, or at least tried to. It came out as more of a wheeze. "Guess I let you down." Frank shook his head. "No, you never did." Hank's hand twitched in Frank's grip, and then, just like that, he was gone. No gasping last words, no long speeches, just silence. Frank bowed his head. He had seen men die before, too many times, in too many places, but this one cut deeper than the rest. Cruz sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I did what I could." Ghost kicked a rock into the dirt. "Mendoza's still out there." Frank looked up. Ghost was right. The fight wasn't finished. The radio on Rojas's body crackled. Bo stiffened. "Oh, hell no!" Frank reached down, grabbing the device, clicking it on. The voice that came through was smooth, cold, and carried no hint of panic. "Mendoza, I assume Rojas is dead." Frank brought the radio closer to his mouth. "Come see for yourself." Mendoza chuckled softly. "Oh, I will, but I'm afraid I won't be coming alone." Frank stood, his grip tightening on the radio. "Send whoever you want. I'll bury them, just like I buried the rest." Mendoza's voice was calm, measured. "You're running out of friends, Callahan, and now I have something you don't." The pause that followed stretched long and cold. Then Mendoza said the words that sent ice through Frank's veins. "I have your niece." Frank's breath stopped. His muscles locked. His vision blurred. Ghost turned sharply. But Frank was already moving, already thinking, already calculating. Mendoza had her, Lena. She was the only family he had left. He had sent her away before the fighting started, told her to leave town, to go as far as she could. But Mendoza had found her. Frank clicked the radio back on, his voice steady, but underneath it the rage was boiling. "Where is she?" Mendoza's voice carried amusement. Now, that would ruin the fun, but don't worry, she's alive, for now." Frank's pulse pounded in his ears. "You hurt her, and I'll take my time killing you." Mendoza chuckled again. I believe you, which is why I'm offering you a deal. Frank's jaw tightened. I'm not making deals. You will, Mendoza said smoothly, because if you don't, I'll send her back to you in pieces. Silence. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and blood. Frank exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. What do you want? Mendoza's answer came without hesitation. Yourself. No tricks, no backup, just you. You come to me, and I let the girl go. Ghost's hand shot out, gripping Frank's arm. It's a setup, Frank ignored him. Where? Mendoza gave him an address. South of the border. Deep in cartel territory. A death trap. Bo shook his head, mouthing, "Don't do it." Mendoza's voice carried a quiet smile. You have 24 hours. Then the radio went dead. Frank stared at the device in his hand. He could feel the others watching him, waiting. Bo finally broke the silence. We ain't letting you go in alone. Frank. Frank didn't answer. He turned toward the wreckage of the barn, toward Hank's body, toward the men who had already given everything for this fight. Kane stepped forward. Frank, you know this is suicide, right? Frank met his gaze. Then I guess I'll die pissed off. Ghost crossed his arms. You go alone, you die, and Mendoza keeps her anyway. Cruz wiped blood from his hands. So what's the plan? Frank looked at them. His brothers, his family. They had already given him more than they owed, bled for him more times than he could count. He wasn't going to ask them to do it again, but they were already waiting for him to. Bo cracked his knuckles. So, when do we leave? Kane smirked. Let's burn this bastard to the ground. Ghost nodded. Mendoza wants a war? We give him one. Frank exhaled. The rage was still there, but now it had focus. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending it. For Hank, for Lena, for all of them. Frank tightened his grip on his rifle. We leave at dawn. The sun barely had time to rise before they were on the road. Frank drove in silence, his hands tight on the wheel, jaw clenched. The others rode behind him, their convoy cutting through the empty stretch of desert highway. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Mendoza had made the terms clear, Frank for Lena, but Mendoza had also made a mistake. He thought Frank was coming to surrender. He wasn't. The radio crackled in the passenger seat. Ghost's voice cut through the static. We're an hour out. Frank didn't take his eyes off the road. Any movement. Ghost was scanning cartel communications from the SUV behind them, feeding him updates. They're set up deep. Compound's got at least 30 men, armed to the teeth. They know we're coming. Bo's voice came next, his tone edged with frustration. This is a goddamn suicide mission. Frank didn't argue. Kane chuckled dryly. Yeah, well, I like those odds. Frank glanced in the rearview mirror. Bo was gripping his shotgun like he was ready to tear Mendoza apart with his bare hands. Kane was checking his explosives, calm as ever. Ghost was scanning maps on his laptop. Cruz sat in the back loading magazines. They all knew what was waiting for them. Frank's voice was steady when he spoke. We do this clean. Get in, get her, get out. We don't leave anyone standing who tries to stop us. Bo scoffed. You say that like it's gonna be easy. Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. Never said it was. The compound came into view just past a ridge, sitting low in a valley of dust and sun-baked earth. It was a fortress, high walls, watchtowers, steel gates. A place built for men who expected trouble. And trouble had come. Frank pulled the truck to a stop behind a rocky outcrop. The others followed suit. They got out, moving to the edge of the hill, looking down at what waited for them. Ghost crouched low, binoculars pressed to his face. Guards on every entrance, patrols along the fence line. That chopper we shot down must have hurt them, 'cause they've reinforced the south side. Less movement there. Frank studied the layout, his mind already breaking it down. That's our way in. Bo exhaled hard. We're gonna need a damn miracle. Kane smirked, patting the C4 strapped to his vest. Good thing I brought a few. Cruz slung his rifle over his shoulder. We do this fast. The longer we're inside, the worse it gets. Frank nodded. Ghost, you cover the exit. Once we've got Lena, we move hard and fast. No stopping. Ghost tapped his earpiece. Understood. The plan was simple. Get to Lena, kill anyone in the way, burn the place to the ground. They moved in the dark, slipping down the ridge, staying low. The dust was thick in the air, clinging to their skin as they crept toward the fence. Ghost had been right. Less security on the south side, but less didn't mean weak. Frank signaled to Kane. On my mark. Kane moved fast, planting a charge near the gate's hinges. The others took position, weapons ready. Frank exhaled. Now. The explosion was small, controlled. The gate crumpled, the metal screeching as it buckled. Before the dust had time to settle, they were inside. Gunfire erupted immediately. Cartel soldiers scrambled, caught off guard, but they reacted fast. Frank dropped the first man before he could raise his rifle. Bo fired next, a shotgun blast tearing through two guards at once. Then the alarms blared. Ghost's voice cut through the chaos. They know you're here! Frank didn't stop moving. Where's Lena? Ghost scanned the compound from his vantage point. Main building, second floor. You're close. Frank motioned to Kane. Cover us! They pushed forward, bullets chewing through the air around them. Mendoza's men were throwing everything they had at them. But Frank and his team had fought worse odds. They moved like a unit, cutting through the resistance, pressing forward. Then Frank saw her, Lena. She was on the second floor, wrists bound, a cartel guard dragging her toward the balcony. She struggled, eyes wild, but the bastard holding her had a gun to her head. Mendoza stepped onto the balcony beside her, his face calm, composed. He looked down at Frank and smirked. Frank raised his rifle, but Mendoza pulled Lena closer, using her as a shield. Mendoza's voice was steady, even over the chaos. Drop your weapons, Callahan! Frank's pulse pounded. He had a shot, a risky one. Ghost's voice was in his ear. Don't! Frank didn't lower his rifle. Mendoza shook his head. You've done enough damage. I gave you a way out. You refused. Now you lose everything. Then he pushed Lena forward. Frank moved before he could think. He fired. The bullet hit Mendoza's shoulder, spinning him backward. Lena tumbled forward, hitting the railing hard before going over. Frank sprinted, ignoring the bullets flying past him. He reached the building, slammed through the door, and took the stairs two at a time. Lena lay on the balcony below, tangled in a broken awning, groaning but alive. Bo covered him from the courtyard. We gotta move, Frank. Frank leapt down, landing hard beside Lena. She looked up at him, dazed, blood on her temple. Uncle Frank? Frank lifted her into his arms. I got you, kid. Gunfire erupted again, more cartel soldiers closing in. Ghost's voice came through the radio. Extraction point is hot. You need to move now. Kane detonated another charge, sending a truck flipping onto its side, blocking the main entrance. Go! Go! Frank ran, Lena in his arms, his legs burning. Bo and Kane covered him, cutting down anyone who got too close. They reached the trucks, Cruz throwing the back door open. Frank climbed in with Lena, pressing her against his chest as bullets riddled the vehicle's frame. Bo floored the gas, tires spinning, kicking up dust. They tore out of the compound, bullets chasing them into the night. Mendoza was alive. They hadn't killed him, but they had taken Lena back, and that was enough, for now. Frank cradled Lena, brushing hair from her face as she clung to him. It's over, he whispered, but he knew it wasn't. Mendoza had lost, and now he was going to come back harder. The war wasn't over, it had only just begun. The convoy cut through the desert, moving fast, the dust thick behind them. The sun was creeping higher, the night's chaos fading into the harsh daylight. Frank sat in the back of the truck, Lena still clutched in his arms. She was breathing, but barely. Her skin was pale, her hands cold. Cruz was already pressing gauze against the wound on her temple, his face tight with concentration. She lost blood, Cruz muttered. Not critical, but she's in shock. Frank didn't speak. He just held her, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding. She had been through hell. Mendoza had taken her, used her as bait, and Frank had walked straight into it. Ghost's voice came through the radio. We're not clear yet. Bo, still behind the wheel, glanced at Frank in the rearview mirror. We got tails. Ghost sounded tense. Nothing yet, but Mendoza's not the type to let this slide. He's regrouping. Kane, sitting in the passenger seat, wiped blood off his hands with a rag. We crippled him. Took out half his men, blew up his compound, left him bleeding. He's going to throw everything he has at us. Frank didn't care. Right now, all he cared about was Lena. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers trembling. Lena, you with me? Her eyelids fluttered. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Rest, Cruz told her. You're safe. Safe. Frank wasn't sure that word meant anything anymore. They reached the farm just before noon. The place was barely standing. The barn was gone, the house riddled with bullet holes. The land was scarred, the fields burned. It wasn't home anymore. It was a battlefield that had been left behind. Bo killed the engine. Nobody moved at first. Then Frank climbed out, lifting Lena in his arms. He carried her inside, laying her gently on the couch. Cruz followed, already pulling out medical supplies. She needs rest, Cruz said. Water, food, and no more bullets flying over her head. Frank stood there, watching her, his chest tightening. Kane stepped inside, rolling his shoulders. We need to talk. Frank didn't turn. Talk. Ghost leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Mendoza's still breathing. Bo exhaled sharply, pacing. Yeah, and as long as he is, we're looking over our shoulders. We gotta finish this. Frank! Frank knew they were right. Mendoza had lost a lot, but not enough. A man like him didn't stop. He didn't retreat. He regrouped. He retaliated. And next time, he wouldn't make mistakes. Kane sat down, rubbing his hands together. We go after him now, before he has a chance to hit back. Frank finally turned, his eyes cold. And where do you think he is? Ghost tapped his laptop, bringing up a grainy satellite image. I tracked cartel chatter. Mendoza retreated to an old ranch deep in Mexico. Remote, heavy security. But he's wounded. He's licking his wounds, waiting to strike. Bo cracked his knuckles. Then we don't give him time. Frank stared at the image. Mendoza's last stronghold. This was where it had to end. Cruz cleared his throat. You do this. It's not a fight. It's an execution. Frank nodded. I know. Ghost hesitated. If we go in, there's no coming back from it. This isn't just defending a farm. It's hunting a man down and putting him in the ground. Frank didn't hesitate. That's exactly what it is. The room fell silent. They had all killed before. But this was different. This wasn't war. It was personal. Finally, Kane let out a breath. So, when do we leave? Frank looked at Lena, still unconscious on the couch. He brushed his fingers against her wrist, feeling the weak but steady pulse. We end this now. Bo grinned. Damn right we do. They moved fast. Weapons were checked, bags packed. Kane loaded explosives into the trucks. Ghost mapped the fastest route across the border. Frank walked to the porch, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked out at the land, the place he had built, the place he had fought for. It was broken now. There was no rebuilding it. Ghost came up beside him. You sure about this? Frank's jaw tightened. I should have killed him the first time. Ghost nodded. Then let's make sure this is the last time. The convoy rolled out before sunset, heading south. No more waiting, no more defense. This time they were going to Mendoza. And Frank wasn't leaving until the bastard was dead. The road stretched long and empty as they crossed the border under the cover of darkness. The hum of engines was the only sound, the men silent, focused. No one had to say it, but they all knew this was it. There was no coming back from this. They weren't fighting to defend a farm or to hold a line. They were going to kill a man, and every single one of them had already made peace with it. Frank Callahan sat behind the wheel of the lead truck, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tight, his mind locked on Mendoza. He had been fighting for too long. It was always someone else calling the shots, always someone else setting the terms. But not this time. This time, it was going to end the way Frank wanted. Ghost sat beside him, quiet as ever, listening to cartel chatter through his earpiece. They know we're coming, he finally said. Frank barely reacted. Good. Bo's voice crackled through the radio from the second truck. You think he's ready for us? Frank exhaled. Doesn't matter. Kane chuckled in the background. I love it when you get like this. The last 20 miles were the hardest. The road turned to dirt, winding through the hills, leading to Mendoza's stronghold, a ranch nestled deep in the valley, surrounded by high walls, patrols, and enough firepower to hold off an army. Ghost tapped the laptop screen, showing a live drone feed. We've got 30 men minimum, snipers on the rooftops, watchtowers, reinforced gates. They're not taking any chances. Bo muttered. Great. I was hoping for a challenge. Kane checked his detonators. We hit hard, no warning, take out their defenses before they know what's happening. Frank studied the layout, his mind breaking it down like an old war plan. We need a way in. Ghost zoomed in on the south side. Security is thinner here, not by much, but it's our best shot. If we take out their power, we even the odds. Frank nodded. Then that's the plan. Bo slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle. Let's burn this place to the ground. They split into 2 teams. Ghost, Cruz, and Kane went for the generator, moving low through the brush. Frank, Bo, and Hank moved toward the main compound, setting up their first line of attack. The night was thick with tension. Then the first explosion hit. A fireball erupted from the side of the ranch, followed by the screech of alarms and the panicked shouting of Mendoza's men. The power cut out, throwing the compound into darkness. Frank didn't hesitate. Go! Bo opened fire first, cutting down a patrol near the entrance. Hank's sniper rifle cracked, dropping a rooftop guard before he could react. Kane's second explosion tore through the gate, sending cartel soldiers scrambling for cover. Frank moved fast, pushing forward through the chaos. The courtyard erupted in gunfire, bullets ricocheting off stone and steel. Mendoza's men weren't running this time. They were fighting. Frank ducked behind cover, returning fire, his rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. A man rushed from the side, but Bo caught him with a shotgun blast that sent him tumbling backward. Kane's voice came through the radio. We're in. Generators down. Security's blind. Ghost added. Mendoza's in the main house. Top floor. Frank exhaled slowly. On me. They moved through the compound like ghosts, cutting down anyone in their path. The house loomed ahead, massive and sprawling, its windows flickering in the firelight. Frank kicked in the door, leading the charge. The halls were a maze of gunfire and smoke. Mendoza's personal guards were dug in, forcing them into tight corners, but Frank and his men were faster, meaner. Bo covered the rear, his machine gun chewing through anything that moved. Kane tossed a grenade down the hallway, clearing the path forward. They reached the staircase. Mendoza was close. Ghost's voice was sharp. 2 guards outside his office. Frank moved first, taking one down with a clean shot to the chest. The second reached for his weapon, but Ghost was faster, putting a bullet through his skull. Frank stepped over the bodies and kicked open the door. Mendoza was waiting. The cartel boss stood behind his desk, a pistol in his hand, his shirt stained with blood from the wound Frank had given him back at the compound. He didn't look afraid. He looked tired. Frank raised his rifle. It's over. Mendoza smirked. Is it? Then he lunged. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. Mendoza staggered, clutching his stomach, but he didn't fall. He raised his pistol, but Frank fired again. A clean shot. Mendoza dropped to his knees, blood pooling around him. He coughed, his breath ragged. You think killing me changes anything? Frank stared at him, his face hard, unreadable. I don't care. Then he pulled the trigger one last time. Mendoza slumped to the ground, silent. Bo stepped into the room, lowering his gun. That it? Frank exhaled, his body finally relaxing. That's it. Kane leaned against the doorframe, shaking his head. Damn. Feels almost too easy. Ghost holstered his pistol. It wasn't. They moved fast, clearing the compound, making sure there were no loose ends. By the time the fires had burned low, the ranch was nothing but a graveyard. Frank stood outside, staring at the burning remains. The war was over, but it didn't feel like a victory. Ghost stepped beside him. What now? Frank didn't answer. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know. The fire burned through what was left of Mendoza's empire, turning the once mighty stronghold into a pile of smoldering ruins. The night air was thick with the stench of burning wood, oil, and death. The gunfire had stopped, but the echoes of war still lingered in the silence. Frank Callahan stood in the middle of the compound, watching the flames dance in the reflection of his rifle barrel. Mendoza was dead. The man who had sent killers to his home, taken his land, taken his family, was nothing more than a lifeless husk bleeding into the dirt. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. Bo adjusted the strap on his shotgun, stepping up beside Frank. "So that's it, huh?" Frank didn't answer right away. He felt the weight in his bones, the exhaustion that ran deeper than just this fight. He had been at war for too long, with too many ghosts following him. Killing Mendoza didn't erase the bodies they had buried along the way. Ghost's voice cut through the smoke. "We need to go. We got what we came for." Frank turned, glancing at the others. Bo, Kane, Ghost, Cruz, they had followed him through hell, and now they stood at the edge of it, waiting to see what came next. Kane lit a cigarette with shaky hands, exhaling slow. "Ain't nobody coming back from this one. We made damn sure of that." Frank looked toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise, bleeding pale light across the valley. There was no cartel left to chase them, no more men coming for their heads. It was over. Cruz wiped blood off his hands, shaking his head. "We should burn the whole thing down, every last piece." Frank nodded. "Do it." Kane grinned. "Gladly." They rigged the last of the explosives to the remaining structures. Mendoza's empire had been built on blood, on fear, on the backs of men too scared to fight back. Frank had spent his life tearing apart men like him, and this was the final piece. The charges were set. Kane flipped the detonator in his hand. "Say the word, Frank." Frank took one last look at the compound, at the place where all of this had led. He thought of Hank, of the men they had lost, of Lena back at the farm, waiting for him to return. "Light it up." Kane pressed the detonator. The explosion ripped through the valley, sending a fireball into the sky. The ground trembled beneath them, and for a moment it felt like the entire world was coming down. The flames roared high, devouring everything Mendoza had ever built. Bo let out a low whistle. "Damn, that's a thing of beauty." Frank turned away from the blaze. "Let's go home." They loaded up, engines roaring to life. The convoy pulled away, rolling through the desert, leaving the destruction behind them. Ghost rode in the passenger seat beside Frank, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "No one's following," he murmured. Frank nodded. "They won't." Bo's voice crackled through the radio. "So what now? We just disappear?" Frank kept his eyes on the road. "That's the idea." Kane chuckled. "Yea, good luck with that." They drove in silence for miles, the desert stretching out endless before them. No more gunfire, no more voices on the radio promising death, just the open road and the weight of everything they had done pressing against their shoulders. As they neared the border, Ghost tapped his laptop, glancing at Frank. "We made it out clean. No cartel, no cops. We're ghosts." Frank exhaled slowly. Not yet. Lena was waiting when they got back. She was sitting on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket, her face still pale from everything she had been through. But the moment she saw Frank step out of the truck, her eyes filled with something else, relief. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around him, her body shaking against his. "You came back," she whispered. Frank held her close. "Always." Bo clapped a hand on his shoulder, grinning. "Hell of a homecoming." Frank let out a breath, glancing around at what remained of his farm. The land was still scarred, the house still riddled with bullet holes. There was no fixing it, not really. Kane kicked at the dirt. "So, you staying?" Frank looked at Lena. She was all he had left now, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like fighting anymore. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm staying." Ghost smirked. "I didn't think you'd ever say that." Frank glanced at the others. "And you?" Bo cracked his knuckles. "Think I'll stick around for a bit. Got nothing better to do." Kane chuckled. "Besides, somebody's got to make sure you don't go soft." Cruz exhaled. "We've been fighting for so damn long, maybe it's time we figure out what it means to stop." Frank nodded. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time he was willing to find out. As the sun set, they sat on the porch, the sky burning orange and red. The war was over, and for the first time in his life, Frank Callahan was ready to live. The morning came slow, stretching long over the battered remains of the farm. The land was still scarred, the house still standing but just barely. The bullet holes in the walls, the blackened earth where bodies had fallen, it was all still there, a reminder of what had happened, a reminder of what had been won, or maybe just what had been survived. Frank Callahan sat on the porch, a fresh cup of coffee in his hands. He hadn't slept. He wasn't sure if he ever would again, not properly. The weight of too many battles, too many dead, too many nights staring at the dark, waiting for the next fight. It never really went away. The others were inside, still asleep or at least pretending to be. Bo had passed out in an old chair, his shotgun still across his lap. Kane was stretched out on the couch, his boots propped up on the table. Ghost had disappeared to wherever he went when he wasn't in front of a screen, and Cruz had stayed with Lena most of the night, making sure she was all right. Frank stared out over the land. This place had once been his escape, his quiet. Now it was a graveyard. He had won, but he had lost just as much. Maybe more. Lena stepped onto the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Her hair was still a mess, her face still pale, but she looked better, less fragile, stronger. She sat down beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. "You ever gonna sleep?" Frank took a sip of coffee. "Maybe." She studied him for a long moment. "It's really over." Frank didn't answer right away. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that Mendoza was dead, the cartel was gone, and there was nothing left to fear. But he knew better. "It's over for now," he finally said. Lena exhaled, nodding slowly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Frank set his cup down, rubbing his hands together. "You go on. You live. You find something that makes this worth it." She turned toward him. "And you?" Frank looked out at the land again. "I don't know." The screen door creaked as Bo stepped outside, yawning, stretching his arms over his head. "Well, I'm still here, so I guess we need a new plan." Kane followed him, scratching at his beard. "New plan? Hell, we just got done with the old one." Ghost appeared in the doorway, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Cartel's done, but that doesn't mean trouble's gone." Frank glanced at him. "Something I should know?" Ghost exhaled a long stream of smoke. "Mendoza wasn't the only one moving things through this part of the country. You burned down one empire, but another will rise. It's just a matter of time." Bo grunted. "Then we burn that one down too." Cruz leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "We ain't the law, boys," Kane smirked. "No, we're worse." Frank sighed, running a hand over his face. He had spent his life fighting. He had told himself that this would be the last time, that once Mendoza was gone, he could finally stop. But Ghost was right. Men like Mendoza weren't rare. They were everywhere, building new empires, tearing people apart, just waiting for someone to stand in their way. And maybe that's what they were now, the men who stood in the way. Lena shifted beside him. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Frank didn't answer. He didn't have to. Bo chuckled. "Hell, I ain't got anything better to do." Kane stretched, rolling his shoulders. "So what? We just go looking for the next bad guy?" Ghost flicked his cigarette into the dirt. "We don't have to look far." Frank sat back in his chair, looking at the men around him, his brothers, the ones who had fought beside him, bled beside him, lost beside him. He had thought this was the end of the road, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just another turn. He looked at Lena. "You don't have to stay." She gave him a small smile. "Yeah, I do." Frank exhaled slowly. He had spent so long trying to outrun his past, trying to find a place where he could just be left alone, but maybe that wasn't who he was anymore. Maybe it never had been. Kane clapped his hands together. "Well, shit, If we're doing this, we better get started. Bo grinned. Where to, boss? Frank Callahan picked up his coffee.